So I'm here with the architecture collective DAAR, which consists of Sandi, Hilal and Alessandro Petti. You have been working for many years together, working on questions what you call decolonizing architecture and refugee camps and reconsidering the idea of heritage, of space, of politics, of citizenship. So it's a very huge and complex and ambitious project. And this spring you will be participating in the Architecture Biennial in Venice. You also have a new book coming out, Refugee Heritage. So I would like to begin by just asking about your work and how this book, how it reflects on your work.
So the book usually is actually a last chapter usually of this longer research project that's in this specific case started at least 6 years ago. And it's part of this longer investigations around refugee camps, and it started from simple questions about history of refugee camps and more also understanding the structures, the architecture of the refugee camp, also the fact that the refugee camps are always dismissed by states or NGO and even by the community itself, of course, that would not like to see their life inscribed in a place that should be temporary and is set up usually as a sort of emergency. When we started this project, I think it was part, as I said, of a longer investment that we have specifically in one camp, which is the Haitian refugee camp, which is in Bethlehem. And that was a very, I guess, maybe provocative questions also towards the people that we work with. It was asking if the Haitian had a history. And that, of course, is provocative questions because, of course, recognizing a history of the camp means also somehow dealing with the present reality that negates the right of return. So for us was then a kind of entry point, asking this question. So the book somehow it started from there, an investigation about the history of the refugee camp.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know. I mean, the fact that we wrote the book in Sweden also influenced a little bit our thoughts on what does it mean actually to carry a history while you are a refugee, right? A lot of time this story of being refugees is inscribed within a very humanitarian framework, people that need help, people that need support, without realizing that these are very strong stories. I mean, people lived such an experience that we need to find a way to inscribe them in our human history, right? And we only inscribe them from one point of view, from a very humanitarian point of view, without realizing that the ones maybe in our history in this moment, the sort of the highly political subjects that are refugees are only looked at from one specific frame. So I guess that the Refugee Heritage book is trying to open up and says, can we understand today heritage in a broader way, heritage in a way that would include stories that are maybe outside of nation states narration, that are not inscribed as such today. And our is a challenge, is to rethink heritage today in our present time.
I mean, the notion of heritage, I remember a long time ago reading a book by the French historian Françoise Chouet, the allegory of patrimony. She says the whole idea of culture, heritage, of patrimony around the French Revolution is really inscribed in the national state as a kind of celebrating and creating the kind of genealogy of the nation. But you propose heritage in a very different way. And yeah. I mean, how decolonizing heritage, what does it mean?
I guess from the beginning there was a sort of we took a strategic decisions, I would say, in order to ask these questions. We also thought that in order to ground these questions, so that it will not just be a kind of hopefully only an intellectual interesting challenge, was also to ground this into UNESCO World Heritage nomination process. And of course here I will not say let's say, specific things about, how UNESCO is grounded into a specific, colonial, Eurocentric understanding of heritage. That's, I think, is somehow well known, acknowledged by UNESCO itself. So that's, I will give it a little bit for granted. What we were interested in, it was to use the very structure of the nomination process as an architecture in itself. There are guidelines for nominating a site as a World Heritage Site. And of course, the interesting thing in this case would be also asking who has the right to nominate a site. Usually, in fact, there are this, one of the endless paradoxical situations that this process somehow is made of is also the fact that on one side claim universalism, but we do know that the only entity can nominate a site actually are nation states. So of course it's embedded into a nation state, but nevertheless, somehow claim, this kind of universalism, which is typical sometimes of the Western thinking, of projecting its own provincial thinking into the world and saying that is what everyone should understand as heritage. So we, in a sense, we felt that tactically was not enough just to dismiss that, because in a way the conventions around heritage are also what defines all over the world today what constitutes heritage. And we say we actually have to challenge this as we would challenge a colonial building. So in architecture we have the same questions. If you have a building that embeds violence and embeds a certain ideology, as maybe a fascist building could have, the question is that what you do with it. You can of course dismiss and demolish, but would be that enough? Or maybe it's interesting to rethink that very structure and reopening new windows, doing maybe prostheses to the building itself and imaging differently. So that was also what we tried to do tactically. It was also to use the guidelines, but of course, to subvert the content. And sometimes, we couldn't even use some of the headlines that were suggesting. So what we hope that is not only the redefinition of the camp, but also is a way of undoing the category of heritage itself. Because if we know that, especially on the Latin roots of heritage, it's inscribed, this idea of the father passing on, a sort of usually it's objects and inheritance. And we believe also that through that we are not embracing any, in a sense, even the colonial heritage. I don't believe that heritage can be decolonized. In this case, we should be liberated from the concept itself. But of course, there is also this double work needs to be done, which is working within and against the very structure.
And indeed, maybe also there is a very important dimension where thinking UNESCO, it obliges us to think what does it mean if we want to nominate the camp, how that would work, especially the serial nomination we are proposing, because we are not only nominating the camp, we are nominating the camp and the 44 villages from where refugees are coming. So it's a serial one. And of course this would require absolutely that the state, the so-called state of Palestine and the state of Israel to come together and both go to UNESCO and decide to nominate the Haitian refugee camp and the 44 villages as a UNESCO site, the heritage site. And of course this is an impossibility.
Seems unlikely.
Seems unlikely that would ever happen. But indeed this is where a lot of time our projects come from, is that how can we create sort of openings. Indeed, now we are speaking about the nomination, discussing the nomination with camp community, with heritage experts, with people from even UNESCO. But in a sense, we sort of say it's that this impossibility is giving us a ground from where to departure and say this is where art makes sense. This is where in this sphere should we accept reality if reality is not justice, or we can sort of bypass it by proposing certain projects that indeed in a place like Venice Biennale, where we will be nominating the Haitian, or other art platforms, we can still be proposing certain things that maybe reality in this moment would not permit us to think through or to do.
You mentioned that there are specific dimensions to this project because you've been doing it here in Stockholm, at least parts of it. And I know you, Alessandro, you have been teaching here in Stockholm at the Royal Institute of Art, where you have involved your students in this project. So it's interesting to hear, from both of you, how one can use these themes or implement them in teaching the students here in Sweden.
Right. First, I think for us it's been always very interesting and energizing to always cultivate research practices and architectural practice with teaching. The teaching has to do also with the possibility to always have every year the energy of a new community of students around which one could think together and to research together. So, and of course, it's never an easy relations because of course it's always a very delicate and every time needs to be built differently. In this specific case, the move here, and I would say for us, the move in Europe was also reformulating the answer to the question, what does it mean to decolonize? Of course, in Palestine had a specific meaning, and of course has to do with specific political reality of Palestine being basically under a regime of apartheid and segregations. In the moment that our body moved to Europe, that answer to the questions of what does it mean to decolonize shifted in a way, in my case specifically, to try to address also colonial history and more specifically also colonial fascist architecture. So the first year with the course with the students, we first went to study the ways in which people in Eritrea and Ethiopia reuse colonial fascist architecture. In 2017, Asmara, which is the capital of Eritrea, was declared UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we were very much intrigued by how it was possible that fascist colonial architecture that were built during the Italian colonization of Eritrea was then nominated as a World Heritage Site by the Eritrean government. And that was for us an interesting question that can also, as I said, trying to then bring it back into the European questions of how fascist colonial buildings have been reused. And specifically, in my case, I come from the south of Europe, and what I find for me pretty interesting was to see how the south of Europe was essentially an internal colony during especially the fascist time. But of course, all these things were in place way before with liberal governments. But of course, as usual happens historically, fascism just made things more radical and clear on those processes. And for me, what interesting things was to ask this question, especially in relation to the new rural towns that were built in Sicily by an entity that was called Entity of Colonization of Sicily. So again, I guess for someone that does research, fascism make things even more clear. They didn't try to hide. That was simply the name of this agency, public agency. It was called Entity of Colonization of Sicily. That was essentially the copy of the Entity of Colonization of Libya, the Entity of Colonization in Eritrea and Ethiopia. So, and therefore there was definitely a link at that time. Architects were equally, asked to colonize or better modernize the south of Italy in the same way they were asked to modernize the territory that was understood as not modern and civilized. I think that, for example, was a shift to these questions around also the notion of heritage, around the fact that colonial fascist heritage, especially in architecture as an architectural discourse, in my architectural education was never problematized. There was always this trick of separating aesthetics from political and social environments. There was always this idea, but that is beautiful architecture. So how you can be questioning that. I mean, as if that would be enough just for the preservations of architecture itself. So with the students, I think the interesting part was that starting from this specific history, and that is where I would say our research is also used to mobilize questions that we hope can be relevant also for students that come, of course, from different contexts. So we had people in this case from Brazil that were then doing their investigations in the colonial architecture in Brazil, etc. So that also what is extremely interesting and powerful. Then your individual research trajectory can be shared, and instead of becoming a model, become rather a way that can enter in dialogue with similar questions that other people can ask in the part of the world. And that is a little bit the connections that we had between the work that we started as a Refugee Heritage that now is in the book, and this new project that is around the afterlife of colonial fascist architecture.
Indeed, actually in that sense, we, for us, the project of the entity of decolonization is quite part of a process that we began together in Palestine. But when we came back to Europe, I have to say that it became very clear the connection between the frame that colonialism created and migration, right? So for me, it became very important to question my position as a migrant in Europe, and what does that mean? What kind of entitlement could I have? Is it only about me accepting to be assimilated in Europe and being integrated on Europe, or it is about finally bringing decolonization in Europe and begin to think together, what does it mean how decolonization can look like if we discuss it in the metropolis, not anymore in the colonies outside, from where everybody thinks that the task of decolonization is about people that were colonized, right? It's not about the colonizer. While we believe that the first ones to actually need and have the responsibility to deal with decolonization are mainly the colonizers, the metropolis, the place from which the whole idea of civilizing the world came. So indeed, the entity of decolonization is a way for us, maybe as it happened DAAR in Palestine. DAAR means home in Palestine, where we transform our house into an entity, where we began to think how today we think decolonizing architecture. Entity of decolonization wants to do a similar process, but to begin from Sicily, from the place exactly, the south of Europe, one of the main doors of Europe, and understand how can we begin from there to think decolonization today. So I think this is a little bit the similar struggle that we normally come to decolonization from different perspectives, but when we put them together, it suddenly becomes so clear to us of why we are doing what we are doing.
I'm just curious, Alessandro, that there's this thing, I guess you wrote that in the preface of the book, where you speak about this film by Pasolini, which was really weird. Can you just tell me about it? So, what is the film? I haven't seen it.
I think Pasolini used this very interesting also way of going around and searching for locations for his movies, and then commenting on things that he would see. And in his incredible style was always to be very honest and open about the things that he would be looking at. And the one on Palestine, when he was searching for locations in 1966, that is somehow, and this was never edited, so these are just footnotes,
Has been shown, because I've never seen the film.
Yes. I mean, for people that, of course, are interested, it's very specific, because it's not a movie, it has never been edited, but of course, for people also that are interested in that sort of also filmmaking, I think it's particularly interesting, because it exactly contain that sort of, live reflections on the things that you see, and things that we were searching for this movie, that is the Gospel according to Matthew. And of course, as many other European intellectuals went to Palestine, with this baggage of Marxism, but also, of course, certain idea that he was influenced by with the Bible. No? I mean, that has been always for centuries. The problem of Palestine. No? That's somehow, especially European visitors, or were always projecting a certain reality. No? And of course, in the case of Pasolini, the interesting part was that, of course, he has definitely a very sharp understanding of many things. But what was, for me, particularly striking and irritating was for me, the fact that how he was incapable to see. So, and it shows, the problem of maybe I would argue the kind of leftist European that can get to this kind of criticism until a certain point. It can never then push to the point in which there is an identification with so-called other. The other remains always the other. There is, this is everywhere in this movie, but it's particularly striking when he look at some of the people, no, and says, I cannot use these people because it's clearly they were kids in the streets, people that he just meet randomly. I cannot use them as he was used to do, just bringing people in this movie that were not professional actors. I cannot use them because they have not witnessed the Christianity. They don't know anything about Christianity, and therefore they are barbarian. No. And then he continues, going around, and you see that in this documentation, you see how he becomes so irritated that Palestine was not this monumental biblical place that he had in mind. And say, what is this? I can recreate this in Cinecittà, way better. That's not. It's so. These hills are so small. These people are barbarian. It's like he was very disappointed. And he end up in Jerusalem, and this is 1966. Jerusalem is divided in two. So half is at that time occupied already by Israel, and the other half is still Jordanian territory. And he's just sitting there on the border, and he doesn't say anything about that reality. No, he doesn't. A city that is divided into this holy city, and he's sitting there with this priest that was used as a kind of expert, and saying, how come this place is so barbarian? And the priest said, but maybe before the Arabs. Actually, there was civilizations, then the Arabs came here, and of course these are all kind of, very important materials for me that also helped me to really take a distance, from this kind of critical studies, leftist discourse that arrive, especially Marxism, that somehow continue to perpetuate, this colonial gaze. And that was for me a very important moment of realizations. And I wanted to take my small revenge, and the small revenge was that we commissioned Luca Capuano, which is an Italian photographer.
Who also did the photographs of this book.
Exactly, that is part of this dossier, nomination dossier. And he was the one that was commissioned by UNESCO to actually take documents the UNESCO World Heritage Site in Italy. With this kind of monumental view. And I asked him, you should come to Palestine and you should see what Pasolini couldn't see, stay and actually use the same frame that he used for this monument for the camp. And the result of this documentation is exactly that sort of, view that we force him, for example, to remain during the night in the camp. If you imagine when we say refugee camps, everyone has always this place of poverty and this endless day. Refugee camps, it's only 24 hours a day. There is no night. No one, it seems, is inhabiting the camp at night. The book starts, with this prelude in which you enter in the book and you enter in the camp during the night, which is also for us, in our personal experience, so much connected with another heritage site that we lived as students, which is Venice. So Venice, in fact, people tend to forget that was built by refugees that were escaping the invasion of the northern east part of Italy, and this is why they went to live in a lagoon that is the last place where actually you will settle. And Torcello was the first camp that was ever built, and then through history today we recognize this as beautiful, and actually everyone would not disagree that could be a heritage. But walking in the camp at night also, it reminds us, even the acoustic of Venice. It reminds us the possibility of smelling the food, and even all the not very pleasant things as in Venice. So it also for us as a personal trajectory was, what if we say that actually the Haitian has a certain quality that can constitute heritage, things that actually can be preserved. And from that on, I guess, this kind of more personal but also hopefully collective dimensions, in this critical ways in which Palestinian, in this case Pasolini, couldn't see. It was this more revenge to see now, with this nomination dossier, we oblige you to actually see what you couldn't see.
So I was curious. Sorry, I was curious about the connection to certain theoretical concepts that you cite in the introduction of the book. For instance, Hannah Arendt, Georgia Agamben, and specifically, I think Agamben, who has thematized from the mid-90s onwards the idea of the camp as a kind of paradigm of modernity in a certain way, and the camp not just out there somewhere in the outskirts or somewhere, but as something that somehow traverses social space. Is that something you've been thinking about? I mean, you mentioned it, but how do you see that? Is that a theoretical resource for you?
Yeah, no, indeed, actually, it's maybe the moment that when we departed from refugee camps, this was maybe our reference, right?
Yeah.
The theoretical reference. But then working in the camp and being there for a long time, you would understand that state of exception goes many ways. It's not only in that sense the bare life of refugees that are in a need of help and relief and be taken care of, but there is many other, and this is what we argue, right, that it's not only this, but in the camp there is a certain life that is not inscribed, right? And in that sense, maybe we use very much a concept called mujawara, which is being neighbors, because refugees manage to be neighbors in a way that we don't understand in cities, right? Manage to be together in a certain way and build organically a certain kinds of relation where indeed they sort of break almost the separation between the private and the public, and categories such as private and public does not make any sense in a place like a refugee camp. So we were very much intrigued then, what is happening in the camp and how can we understand it beyond only relief and indeed bare life and people that only needs to be helped and supported. So I guess it's from there. But even Agamben himself, at a certain point in one of his articles, he looks at Palestinian refugee camps and he says this is maybe the place from where something can be happening, right? So it was also a way of him pointing at these camps as a place where to understand further by what does it mean. But I guess that we were very much also interested in the practice of the camp, what happened and what is happening beyond the humanitarian framework of the refugee camp is what drive also this project to become a real project.
There's a place where you just, I think it's one of the general descriptions of your work that I found online, that you say that your one of the key problems is how to think beyond citizenship, or to think beyond the liberal conception of citizenship. And I mean, there are many people, Etienne Balibar and many others, who have a discussion. There's a huge discussion in political philosophy and theory about what's, citizenship means. And what is your take? I think it's about decolonizing architecture. How will architecture play into the question of citizenship?
Yeah, I guess maybe following what also Sandi was somehow describing for us, a very important learning moment. I also personally, I already was interested in camps, while I was studying and doing my PhD in Venice, where Agamben was one of my professors. But Palestine, in a way, had an important fundamental dimensions that was also recognizing the side of the agency of refugees themselves, and especially Palestinian refugees that have been living in camps for so many years. So I had, in that sense, also to overcome some Western categories, and as Sandi mentioned, we had to mobilize notions like mujawara or masha'a or other terms that were more precisely capturing what actually refugees themselves built, despite the fact that this was originally a space created and carved out from state sovereignty. And that kind of dimensions is a dimension that really moves, our interest, is really where we also decided, for example, to establish a university that's called Campus in Camps, because that was the need of understanding the reality that's in front of your eye, but you don't have the conceptual categories. In my personal experience, I always had the kind of opposite problem, that when you study at university, it seems that your conceptual world is always more advanced, that kind of reality that looks so banal and so uninteresting and so stuck into this kind of very conservative world. Meanwhile, in the camp, you have the opposite. You, at least that was my experience, that you live, for example, a collectivity that you cannot define as a public space. People live in houses that in which no one talks about ownership as a private ownership. They don't have legal documents, but everyone knows that actually they use as their houses. And this is where one has to rebuild completely conceptual categories. And this was why for us it was important also to move university in the camp, to say that this should be the place of university where you have to do this very practical work of working on concepts. That the conceptualization in theory becomes the most practical things that you can do, because somehow that reality that maybe in Western philosophy is imagining, how this world beyond a citizenship is understood, in this nation-state format. When you are in the camp, I think you already have that reality. You already are in contact with spaces and people and social organizations as their houses. And this is where one has to rebuild completely conceptual categories. And this was why for us it was important also to move university in the camp, to say that this should be the place of university where you have to do this very practical work of working on concepts. That the conceptualization in theory becomes the most practical things that you can do, because somehow that reality that maybe in Western philosophy is imagining, how this world beyond a citizenship is understood, this nation-state format. When you are in the camp, I think you already have that reality. You already are in contact with spaces and people and social organizations that is not an utopian world. This is the reality. But again, back to Pasolini, we are blind because we are constantly use our categories that somehow prevent us, or at least people have been trained in the Western educational system, in which you don't understand and you don't see that, or you find difficult to see, because somehow that is already something that's called for questioning, this category. Because if you enter in the camp and you say a street is public and the house is private, it doesn't work like this. Because the street actually is the most collective space that they have. One example we were giving, that usually women in the camp, for example, might wear a veil in the camp everywhere, but they don't wear the veil in the camp, because they consider this as their space. But when they walk out, it become a sort of more public space. They wear it. So in the streets, they will not feel that they are walking outside their comfortable space and their private spaces. So these are just a sort of example to say that there are so many different dynamics that somehow subvert categories, especially for architects that understand the city in this private public dimensions. Who take care of the street where you don't have a municipality. In the camp you don't have a municipality, and nevertheless people have a different system to deal with that. So that was for us somehow the interest. And back to your questions, is from there that instead of speculating of a world that will come as a sort of messianic moment at some point, in which we are liberated from that, I guess these are situations which that world is already here, is already present. And this is where I think we should concentrate and focus on and work, not being trapped into this utopian messianic idea that there will be a tomorrow in which everything will be solved. Rather working and reinforcing and acknowledging that already in the present we have situations that already speak beyond these cages of nation states. Yeah.
I'm thinking of, there's a long tradition, of I don't know if it's comparable or not, but studying the architecture of the favelas, for instance, kind of informal architecture, and that would be, for instance, Rem Koolhaas, certain big investigations of African big cities, so kind of informalized structures that work differently. Could that be part of such a discourse? Could that be, or is that a completely different?
Well, I think that in the case of the camp, what was very clear since the beginning and the moment that it was established is that it was immediately politicized. Yeah. So architecture became a very important political tool and discourse. Yeah. Since the first moment, since the moment that they began to replace tents into walls and arrive to the roof, and asked, should we build the roof or shouldn't we build it? Because what does the roof means in terms of us accepting settlements? Yeah. How the roof would jeopardize the right of return? Where this would take us? So definitely I would say that the lesson to be learned from refugees is that they began to conceptualize, problematize, politicize their spaces the first exact moment that they were in. They did not let it to others to, inscribe it, socialize it, or give. And indeed, what we did is simply to interact with what they have been doing since ages in a very humble way, saying, there is a whole sort of knowledge here that as architects we are blind to see, and we just let ourselves in to learn from the camp and not to all the time understand the camp from a city point of view, because as if the city is the center and the camp is the informality of the city. In the contrary, that the camp is the center, and how can we understand the city from a camp point of view and not the other way around? So I guess that we shifted really paradigm the moment that we began to live the camp in this way.
So you are now participating in this year's architecture biennial in Venice, and I would like to hear how you present your work there.
Well, actually, it's a quite long trajectory, because in 2003 our first work together was entitled Stateless Nation in Venice Biennale, in Venice Art Biennale. And it was a moment where we were commissioned by the curator, Francesco Bonami, to think about the Palestinian pavilion in Venice. And we immediately thought, what does it mean to have a Palestinian pavilion in Venice the moment that we are speaking about statelessness? And indeed we decided not to go in a building, but we selected 10 of Palestinian documents that are carried by Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Palestinian refugees in Syria, and everywhere. And we decided to enlarge these documents and throw them or spread them in between the nation states as a question, a simple question of who is represented in this place, and how can we today think about statelessness in a place like Venice Biennale? Well, many years after, almost 18 years after, I think, from 2003, we sort of realized, and especially because, we went back to the camp and to the representation and understanding who is really in between these nation-state pavilions, right? Because we put these passports in between and we were questioning about representation. And then coming back to the refugee camp and working all these years, we arrived not only representation, but the right to heritage, the right to inscribe heritage. And indeed, now we return back to Venice Biennale with an installation called Stateless Heritage, with this idea of nominating the Haitian refugee camp and the 44 villages of origin as part of the World Heritage sites. And indeed, this is for us, actually, it goes beyond the Biennale itself as a place of installation, beyond the installation itself, because what the installation is doing is that how do you use this international platform, international art platform, to sort of nominate something and use it and make voice for something that the world in this moment is not ready to do, right? So we are taking this occasion to nominate officially the Haitian refugee camp, have people voting for it, and where the framework of the Biennale is simply becoming the international framework from which we sort of taking as an occasion to nominate the camp and to give it a certain sort of artistic legitimacy. I don't know what to call it, but definitely this is what matters for us in Venice Biennale. And of course there is the installation, but the installation is about that nomination, and what matters is that this nomination happened in the International Venice Biennale. So this is for us quite crucial.
But maybe, I don't know, in this one point that I would just try to add is the ways in which exhibitions work in our own practice. And exhibitions are not for us just a site of display of a work, but are usually also a site in which we can run some experiment, but also a site that is in constant communications and linked to things that are happening outside the exhibition space. So there is no, in that sense, autonomy of the installations, as a kind of individual work, but always a very important space, in fact, because allowed us to do things that maybe we cannot yet do in reality, and communicate with that sort of reality. So in this case, for example, in the installations where there is on the Refugee Heritage, we work already on how on what will happen to the camp in the moment that is recognized. We already pose what I think that's actually for us the most interesting thing. Why at some point we started to do art exhibitions, or why was we were interested in the arts, because somehow until now for us was a space we could create a reality, a conditions that you cannot create or radicalize, as an architect, for example, right? So then the exhibitions for us become this sort of place in which we can radicalize certain ideas, in which we can, for example, as it is also in these cases, or it was the case in which we also use in Documenta, we can make assemblies of people that somehow, similar to UNESCO, will discuss the nomination. So in occasion of these exhibitions, we will organize a general assembly, where in this case it will be chaired by representatives from the stateless nations, where we will present the nominations, and then there will be people that will be actually voting, and these are people, of course, from the camp, but also other people that have been invested into this process. So that sort of conditions that mimic the reality of the nation state was for us also to, as usual, to do two things at the same time. One, to show the fictional element of these organizations, that we take so seriously, but at the same time also work within these cracks in order to see who, of course, cannot be present in those assemblies. So the camp itself, of course, cannot be present, but also the community of refugees that now are almost 70 million. So, and that is the question that we pose, who should nominate the Haitian refugee camp as as a World Heritage Site. Who has the right to do that? Definitely not the nation state that actually create them, but is it maybe the community of the stateless national people that actually have the possibility to recognize, you know, their existence, and from there, as we were discussing before, imagining what kind of political organization one could think from these spaces, from these extraterritorial spaces, you know, instead of somehow thinking that we need to cure refugees with the idea of back to an idea of citizenship that lock people into the idea of nation state. Why don't we flip the question and we say, can we reimagine a reality from the perspective of refugees that, of course, has belonged to different places at the same time, and which is ultimately also a radical idea of freedom of movement among those places. I mean, that is a kind of, for us, interesting political and architectural questions that we should try to engage with, rather than, you know, try somehow to cure refugees either by integration into the idea of citizenship, or also normalizing the camp and making the camp, you know, just another kind of slum or you know, or pseudo-functional space. So we just try to think: is it possible to imagine the city from the camp and refugee perspective? How the city then will look like? And I guess especially now, where public spaces also lost any legitimacy, no? And that would be also another way to restart that conversation.